Madam Speaker, I am speaking today in support of Bill C-291, which would introduce mandatory labeling for genetically modified foods. I support sending this bill to committee for second reading, where expert witness testimony can bring evidence as to how Canada can move forward in regards to providing information to Canadian consumers on genetically modified foods. I support the labeling of genetically modified food as it provides transparency for Canadians. I have heard from many people in my community that would also like to see this type of labeling information. And I would like to take this opportunity to applaud the Big Carrot Natural Food Market, which is in my riding and goes beyond selling food to providing information and workshops about organic foods, natural health products, and environmental issues. They have been tremendous advocates on the issue of genetically modified organisms and labeling. While I support this bill going to committee, I do see some issues with how it is written, and I believe that improvements should be made to benefit consumers and producers. There has been a lot of discussion in this place about the pros and cons of genetically modified food. And while there can be a very long and worthwhile debate on this issue, the truth is that labeling debate does not require members in this place to make any such pronouncements. Before genetically modified products are sold to Canadians, they undergo a health and safety assessment by Health Canada to determine whether they are safe and nutritious as their conventional counterparts. In order to label genetically modified foods, we do not need to debate the scientific analysis. As been pointed out in another debate earlier in this place, GMOs are different from one another and need to be examined separately by Health Canada to determine their health safety. What Canadian consumers are requesting is that their food be properly labeled. Genetically modified foods, people who want this labeling may have other concerns beyond health and safety. They may have environmental concerns, and they may have concerns about seed ownership. Others may feel entirely fine about genetically modified food, but they just want to know what is in their food regardless. Ultimately, labeling is about transparency, and I welcome this transparency. Labeling allows us to know the composition of the food we purchase, and we can choose from there whether or not we want it. This is all about giving choice and informing the consumer. From a legislative perspective, the new regulation-making authorities in Bill C-291 could be unnecessary, since the Food and Drug Act already contains provision in subparagraph 30, sub 1, sub B, that provides authority to create regulations that support the Food and Drug Act's prohibition of false and misleading labeling of food. And I say this because that could include genetically modified foods in relation to composition. Regulations can be more detailed, and so I point out that this is an additional route for us to consider, and I would like the committee, should it have come to committee after second reading votes, to consider this as well. Bill C-291 responds to the concern that consumers are not being provided proper information about the composition of their food. The Food and Drug Act already has regulations that provide information to consumers in respect of other foods that have been deemed safe by Health Canada and yet require different labeling. The example that I would like to discuss is irradiated foods. I would like to refer to the regulations applying to irradiated foods because irradiation is a process that is reviewed and approved by Health Canada, and yet labeling is required. The labeling regulations set out under the Food and Drug Act are a good example of well-formed labeling regulations, and I would suggest in committees that reference be made to these regulations as a way that we might want to amend or improve this legislation. The labeling regulations for irradiated foods require the identification of wholly irradiated foods on the label of prepackaged products or on signs accompanying bulk displays of irradiated food. While Health Canada is responsible for the regulations, which specify which foods may be irradiated and the treatment levels permitted, the Canadian Food Inspection Agency administers the regulations for labeling irradiated foods. The regulations set out the words that can be used to let people know that the food is irradiated. The regulations set out a mandatory symbol to be used, And there are regulations governing legibility and the location of the labeling. When I look at the example of labeling irradiated foods, I see a model that could equally apply to genetically modified foods. We have a precedent here in Canada for labeling foods that Health Canada has determined to be safe, but for which further information is mandated to be available to Canadians. The irradiation regulations set out further considerations for us for GMO labeling. For example, in the case of irradiation, if an ingredient that is 10% or more of a food is irradiated, it must be listed as irradiated on the label. This raises a question for genetically modified foods. If a food contains only a percentage of genetically modified organisms, for example, only one ingredient out of 10, what then? We should consider that. That's an extra detail that will need to be looked at. This question would need to be looked at in more detail by the committee, and then we could consider how the regulations could probably work for labeling. I've heard and read about additional situations which also require some thought and consideration. For example, if a cow is fed genetically modified feed, is there a requirement to label the milk or the meat as containing genetically modified organisms? How would this be enforced and measured? These are important questions that the committee can investigate and provide recommendations. In the end, my hope is that we would have a comprehensive and thought-out labeling system for genetically modified foods. And this is where we're lucky, because we have models from around the world to learn from. Labeling GMOs, genetically modified foods, is hardly a new idea. It's not novel. In fact, there are at least 64 other countries around the world that require the labeling of genetically modified foods, including the European Union, Japan, Australia, and Brazil. The United States has also recently signed the law called into law the National Bioengineered Food Disclosure Standard regarding the disclosure of genetically modified organisms. We can look to each of these models adopted by these many countries to see what is most appropriate and useful for Canadians. The Parliamentary Secretary for the Minister of Health stated that Canada will be monitoring the U.S.'s government's labeling plans. To this, I would add that we should look to the European Union to examine their approach. Considering the EU approach is particularly timely, since we are looking to greater trade with the European Union following the CETA agreement. The reasoning in support of labeling in the European Union is set out by the Commission as follows. Ensure clear labeling of GMOs placed on the market in order to enable consumers, as well as professionals, such as farmers and food feed chain operators, to make an informed choice. They go on to say, traceability enables tracking GMOs and GMO food or feed products at all stages of the supply chain. Traceability also makes labeling of all GMOs and GM food, feed products possible. It allows for close monitoring of potential effects on the environment and on health. Where necessary, it can allow the withdrawal of products if an unexpected risk to human health or to the environment is detected. There's a precedent. There's some information about the European Union that we can build upon. And it's important to recognize that GMO foods are allowed to be sold in the European Union. They're just labeled. They're deemed to be safe for consumption. They're tested. So labeling is not a ban. It's about providing information. If our food processors and manufacturers intend to be exporting foods to jurisdictions such as the European Union or Japan or the United States, they will need to take GMO labeling into account. So why not provide Canadians with the same information? What I would like to highlight is that this is a good time for us to be making these changes. And I would like to speak today in support of Bill C-291 and sending it to committee for further consideration. Thank you.